They were not taken for ransom, they were not taken for mercy, they were taken as trophies. And in the brutal logic of ancient conquest, the daughters of defeated kings often faced a fate more terrifying than death on the battlefield. Because when a Roman general crushed a rival kingdom, he did not merely seize gold, horses, land and cities. He seized bloodlines, he seized symbols, he seized the living bodies of royal daughters, the daughters who represented legitimacy, dynastic future, political memory, and everything a conquered people had once hoped to become. And what happened to those women after the victory parade was often hidden behind the polished language of Roman glory. This is that story. Not the marble version of Rome, not the clean textbook version of disciplined legions and noble statesmen. But the darker truth buried beneath triumphal arches and bronze statues, the truth about what happened when empire won, and the women of the defeated stood powerless in its shadow. Because for many royal daughters, the fall of their father's kingdom was only the beginning of their nightmare. And once Rome had them, their lives no longer belonged to themselves. They became bargaining chips, humiliation tools, hostages, wives' prisoners, propaganda and warnings. Warnings to anyone else who thought they could resist Rome. But no one saw what came next. To understand why the daughters of defeated kings mattered so much, you first have to understand what Rome actually conquered. Rome did not just defeat armies, it consumed political worlds. Every kingdom it absorbed came with a sacred order, its own rituals, noble houses, marriage alliances, dynastic myths, and inherited claims to power. In monarchies across the Mediterranean, North Africa, the Near East, and beyond, royal daughters were not simply children of privilege. They were diplomatic assets, living vessels of continuity, and future mothers of kings. That made them dangerous, even after defeat. A slain king was one problem. A living princess was another entirely, because as long as she lived, someone somewhere could use her name, her lineage, or her marriage, to claim the throne again. A rebellion could gather around her, a rival prince could marry her, a local elite could rally the old loyalists under her bloodline. Even in captivity, she could remain politically explosive, and Roman generals understood that perfectly. That is why conquered royal women were so rarely left alone to disappear quietly into private life. They had to be managed, displayed, controlled, sometimes honored on the surface, but always neutralized. Everything was about to change. The Roman Republic, and later the Roman Empire, built much of their identity around victory. War was not an occasional emergency. It was a system of expansion, prestige, wealth, and political advancement. A successful Roman commander did not merely return from war with military glory, he returned with loot, captives, influence, and the possibility of immortality in the memory of the state. And one of the most powerful ways to display victory was not simply to show what had been destroyed, it was to show who had been brought to heel. That is where royal daughters entered the machinery of Roman conquest. Because nothing symbolized the collapse of a foreign dynasty more vividly than its women walking behind the conqueror. Imagine the scene. Roman festival mood, streets crowded, incense in the air, trumpets blaring, soldiers laughing and chanting rude songs about their commander, wagons piled high with treasure, exotic weapons, carved idols, ivory, chained captives, and banners stripped from defeated enemies. And then, somewhere in that immense moving theater of domination, came the royal prisoners, not hidden, made visible to the city. A conquered king in chains was powerful enough, but a royal daughter, dressed in foreign clothing, watched by thousands of Roman eyes, could become an even more chilling image. She embodied not just military defeat, but dynastic collapse. The future of a kingdom, now walking in someone else's parade. That was no accident. Rome wanted conquered peoples to imagine that image, and remember it. That decision would alter history forever. This is one of the hardest truths about Roman power. It often understood humiliation better than slaughter. Slaughter could eliminate an enemy. Humiliation could educate the world. A dead king vanished. A captured daughter sent a message, and the message was simple: if Rome defeats you, even your bloodline belongs to us. This is why Roman triumphs were not merely celebrations. They were political theater, carefully staged, emotionally charged, and brutally symbolic. The conquered were transformed into visual proof that the general had not just won a battle, but reordered reality itself. Foreign crowns became props. Foreign gods became loot. Foreign royalty became walking evidence of subjugation. For royal daughters, that could mean the sudden destruction of everything they had been raised to believe was permanent. 1 week perhaps, they were inside palaces of polished stone, moving through rooms guarded by eunuchs, attendants, noblewomen, scribes, tutors, and priests. They may have been educated in languages, diplomacy, religion, court ritual, and dynastic etiquette. They may have grown up knowing that one day they would marry for alliance, secure peace, or carry a kingdom's future in their womb. Then came the siege, the betrayal, the surrender, the massacre, the smoke over the walls, the sound of gates collapsing, the last news from the battlefield, the knowledge that father, brothers, or betrothed had fallen, and then the Romans. Everything was about to change. What happened next varied, depending on the politics of the moment, the importance of the kingdom, and the ambitions of the Roman general involved. But the first and most immediate reality was usually captivity. Captivity stripped royal daughters of the thing that had once protected them most: context. In their own courts, they were daughters of kings. In Roman hands, they were assets. Their names mattered only insofar as those names could be used. That is a terrible transformation. Because once a person becomes politically useful property, every part of her future can be redesigned by strangers. Some were taken as hostages to ensure obedience from surviving local elites. Some were marched across continents to Rome itself. Some were distributed into elite households. Some were used in carefully engineered marriages. Some vanished into silence so complete that history barely preserved their existence. And some, perhaps most tragically, lived on in conditions that looked outwardly respectable, while inwardly amounting to lifelong captivity. That is one of the darkest patterns in ancient imperial history. Not every destruction looks like a dungeon. Sometimes it looks like silk. Sometimes it looks like a villa. Sometimes it looks like protection. But no one saw what came next. To the Roman mind, a captured royal daughter could be useful in several ways at once. First, she could function as a hostage. This was perhaps the most straightforward political use. If a kingdom had been subdued but not fully annihilated, the daughter of its former ruler might be kept under Roman control to guarantee compliance from whoever now governed the territory. Her mere existence in Roman hands was leverage. Imagine what that meant psychologically. Somewhere in a distant palace, a surviving brother, uncle, or allied prince might know that one wrong move could determine her fate. A rebellion could bring punishment. Resistance could bring disappearance. Submission might preserve her life, though even that was never guaranteed. In this way, royal daughters became extensions of Roman military occupation, living chains made of bloodline. Second, they could be used for dynastic engineering. Rome did not always destroy local royalty outright. Often, it preferred to absorb and reconfigure existing elites. In such cases, a royal daughter could be married strategically to a client king, a Roman ally, or a politically useful regional ruler, in order to stabilize a conquered territory under Roman influence. On paper, such a marriage might look like mercy. In reality, it could be a highly sophisticated form of control, because the woman at the center of it was no longer marrying for her own dynasty's future. She was being repositioned so that her bloodline would now serve Rome's interests. Her womb, once expected to produce heirs for her father's house, was now part of imperial architecture. That is the kind of conquest history often fails to describe clearly enough. Rome did not merely conquer land, it reorganized reproduction, it redirected lineage, it reached into the future itself. That decision would alter history forever. And then there was the third use, the most public and perhaps the most psychologically devastating of all: display. A captured royal daughter was not always hidden away. Sometimes she was kept visible, precisely because visibility itself was useful. Roman elites loved symbols, and foreign princesses carried enormous symbolic charge. They could appear in triumphs, courtly gossip, elite spectacle, or diplomatic performance. Their presence reminded everyone that Rome had the power not only to defeat kings, but to rearrange their families. This could become especially cruel when the daughter in question came from a famous or glamorous foreign court. The more exotic, wealthy, or culturally prestigious the defeated kingdom seemed to Roman audiences, the more satisfying its humiliation could be. A royal woman from the East, from North Africa, from a Hellenistic palace, from a court of dazzling luxury, such a captive could ignite enormous fascination in Rome. And fascination is not kindness. Fascination often becomes its own prison, because now the woman is not merely politically useful, she is culturally consumed. People speculate about her appearance, her dress, her accent, her religion, her beauty, her rumored pride, her father's downfall, her possible lovers, her future, her shame. Her trauma becomes entertainment, her displacement becomes conversation, her loss becomes atmosphere. And Rome was very good at turning other people's suffering into atmosphere. Everything was about to change. Some of the most revealing examples come from Rome's encounters with the Hellenistic East, where royal women often occupied unusually visible and politically sophisticated roles compared to what many Roman elites considered proper. In these kingdoms, daughters of ruling houses could be educated, dynastically important, and symbolically potent in ways that both fascinated and unsettled Roman observers. That meant when Rome defeated such kingdoms, the fate of their women became deeply political. Take the broader pattern. Even when individual stories are fragmented, a royal daughter from a defeated Eastern court might arrive in Roman orbit, not merely as a passive captive, but as a person who knew statecraft, court etiquette, dynastic intrigue, and the terrifying mathematics of power. She may have watched ministers betray each other, brothers poison brothers, generals switch loyalties, and empires bargain over her family's future long before Rome arrived. And now she was expected to survive Rome too. That survival required intelligence, silence at the right time, charm when necessary, disappearance when safer. And above all, the ability to understand that her body and her name were no longer private things. They were strategic terrain. This is where the story becomes even more unsettling, because many royal daughters were not destroyed in one dramatic moment. They were slowly repositioned, their lives unfolding under constraint, in ways that history later mistook for ordinary biography. A marriage alliance here, a household transfer there, a respected placement under Roman supervision, an appearance in a source as someone's wife, widow, or mother. And beneath those dry lines may lie a human story of forced adaptation after total dynastic collapse. A woman can survive and still have everything taken from her. Rome understood that very well, but no one saw what came next. There was also another danger, one less often discussed openly in ancient sources, but impossible to ignore when dealing with conquest, captivity, and elite power: vulnerability to exploitation by the men who controlled access, protection, and placement. Ancient historians, especially Roman ones, often wrote around such realities, rather than confronting them directly. They preferred euphemism, scandal, insinuation, or silence. But power imbalances this extreme rarely remain purely administrative. When a royal daughter was cut off from her homeland, stripped of her family's protection, and placed under the control of victorious male elites, her exposure to coercion would have been immense. And coercion does not always announce itself loudly in the historical record. Sometimes it is hidden inside favor, inside patronage, inside arrangement, inside household protection, inside marriage. That ambiguity is part of the horror. Because when history is written by conquerors, the most intimate forms of domination are often the easiest to erase. Everything was about to change. Yet even within this system, some royal daughters were not merely victims in the passive sense Rome preferred. Some adapted, some survived politically, some learned to read Roman ambition and maneuver within it. A woman who had grown up in a royal court was not naive about power. If she lived long enough, she might become dangerous in quieter ways, through influence, through alliance, through memory, through motherhood, through strategic silence. That possibility haunted Rome too, because the daughter of a defeated king could still become the mother of future claimants, the keeper of dynastic legitimacy, or the last living vessel of a vanished kingdom's identity, and that meant Rome could never fully relax around her. Even in apparent safety, she remained watched. Even in marriage, she remained managed. Even in luxury, she remained conquered. And that is perhaps the cruelest truth of all. For these women, there was often no clear moment when captivity ended. There was only life after defeat. Life after defeat could be long. Long enough for the cheering crowds to forget the parade. Long enough for the victorious general to die, for emperors to rise and fall, for new wars to begin, for Rome to move on to fresh enemies and fresher trophies. But for the daughters of defeated kings, the consequences of conquest could stretch across an entire lifetime, and that is what makes their story so disturbing. Because Rome did not simply destroy their world in a single dramatic act. It often forced them to keep living inside the ruins of it. Imagine waking each morning in a foreign house, under foreign customs, hearing a foreign language spoken casually around you, while everyone else treated your old life as a completed chapter. Your father's palace was gone. Your family name, once spoken with ceremony, was now either a curiosity or a problem. Your childhood homeland had become a province, a client state, or a cautionary tale. And yet you were expected to continue, to dress properly, to speak carefully, to smile when required, to marry if ordered, to bear children if necessary, to survive in a world built by the men who had crushed your own. That was the hidden violence of Roman victory. Not only the capture, the continuation. Because Rome excelled at turning catastrophe into administration, a destroyed kingdom became a tax district. A dead king became a line in a record. A captured princess became a political solution. And the colder the system appeared, the more terrifying it really was. Open brutality can at least be recognized for what it is. Bureaucratic domination, dressed in respectability, can erase a person while allowing them to remain alive. That is why some of the most haunting royal stories in antiquity are not always the bloodiest ones. They are the quiet ones, the women who do not disappear in one spectacular scene, but instead spend decades as living reminders of a world that lost. And Rome knew exactly how useful such reminders could be. A daughter of a defeated king could serve as a permanent lesson to others. Visiting envoys might see her. Provincial elites might hear where she had been placed. Rival rulers might understand the implication instantly. If you resist Rome, your sons may die in battle, but your daughters may live long enough to watch your bloodline serve the empire that broke you. That message required no inscription. It was written into the structure of power itself, and nowhere was that clearer than in Rome's obsession with legitimacy. Roman generals were not always content to win militarily. They wanted to absorb the authority of the defeated. That meant taking not only land and treasure, but prestige, ancestry, symbolism, and dynastic memory. Royal daughters were central to that process because they represented continuity. They were links between past and future. They carried the memory of the old regime in the most intimate way possible, through family inheritance and the possibility of descendants. That is why their fate mattered so much. If Rome could control them, it could control the afterlife of the kingdom itself. If Rome could marry them into new political arrangements, it could rewrite succession. If Rome could neutralize them socially, it could weaken rebellion. If Rome could make them visible in defeat, it could transform them into imperial propaganda. And if Rome could make all of this appear civilized, it could do it while still claiming moral superiority. That is the genius and the ugliness of Roman imperialism. It often preferred domination that looked orderly, that looked lawful, that looked inevitable, but no one saw what came next, because beneath that order was always fear. Roman power, for all its confidence, was often deeply anxious. It feared revenge, rebellion, rival claims, prophetic bloodlines, symbolic figures, and the possibility that a conquered people might still remember who they used to be. And royal daughters could become focal points for that memory. A woman does not need an army to threaten an empire. Sometimes all she needs is a name people still believe in. That is why some royal women from conquered dynasties remained politically dangerous even in apparent passivity. A widow could become a symbol. A mother could become a conduit for legitimacy. A daughter could become a marriage prize around whom factions formed. A survivor could preserve dynastic identity simply by continuing to exist. But Rome understood that, which is why the treatment of these women was so often calibrated rather than random. The point was not always to destroy them physically. Sometimes the point was to place them in a controlled environment where they could no longer direct their own political meaning. That is a subtler kind of conquest, and in some ways a more enduring one, because once a woman's life is rearranged by imperial power, she may spend years participating in her own containment simply to stay alive. That does not mean she consented. It means survival under empire is rarely pure. Some royal daughters may have adapted so successfully that later historians mistook adaptation for acceptance. But adaptation is not the same thing as freedom. A woman can become skilled at living inside a cage without ever choosing the cage. She can learn the language, master the etiquette, even gain influence, while still carrying a private map of loss no historian ever recorded. That is one of the hardest things about ancient history. The archive preserves power far better than pain. Roman writers loved to record triumphs, speeches, military reforms, treaties, monuments, and the reputations of great men. They were far less interested in the interior lives of captured royal daughters, unless those women became useful to a scandal, a romance, or a political anecdote. So what survives is often partial, distorted, or filtered through hostile, male eyes. But if you read carefully, a pattern emerges. Again and again, the daughters of defeated kings appear not as free agents in the Roman world, but as transferred pieces on a geopolitical board. Their value is assessed in terms of alliance, threat, beauty, lineage, fertility, or symbolic impact. Even when they are treated well, the language surrounding them often reveals the same underlying truth. Their lives are being arranged by heirs, and that arrangement could shape generations. Because when these women bore children, those children did not emerge in a political vacuum. They carried fused identities, Roman influence mixed with conquered bloodlines, imperial interests intertwined with dynastic memory. In some cases that helped stabilize frontiers. In others, it created new tensions. But either way, Rome was using women's bodies to engineer the future. That is not a metaphor. It is a governing strategy. And once you see it, you start noticing it everywhere in imperial history. The daughter of a defeated king is never just a daughter. She is a border, a treaty, a hostage, a warning, a womb claimed by victory. That decision would alter history forever. And yet, despite everything, some of these women likely carried something Rome could never fully confiscate. Memory, not just personal memory, but civilizational memory. The smell of palace incense from a lost court, the prayers spoken in a language Romans mocked, the genealogies whispered by old nurses, the names of ancestors carved into tombs far away. The stories of how their people once ruled before the eagles came, the rituals, songs, family habits, sacred objects, and buried loyalties that survive conquest precisely because they can be carried quietly. Empires often underestimate quiet things. Rome could seize a throne. It could not always erase what the displaced remembered, and perhaps that is why the stories of conquered royal daughters still linger, even in fragments. Because in them we can see the empire at its most revealing. Not just in battle, but in what it did after the battle was won. That is when the mask slips. That is when victory becomes administration, and administration becomes domination, and domination becomes intimate. Not only on battlefields, but in households, marriage beds, dining rooms, proshi, sessions, nurseries, and legal arrangements. Rome's greatness, if we are going to use that word honestly, was built not only by roads, laws, and disciplined legions, but by the human reordering of defeated lives. And some of the most important of those lives belonged to women whose kingdoms had already fallen by the time history noticed them. So when people imagine Roman conquest, they often picture charging cavalry, siege towers, burning walls, and ironclad legions. But sometimes conquest looked like a young woman being led into a city she did not choose. Sometimes it looked like a formal marriage no one dared call coercion. Sometimes it looked like polite surveillance for the rest of her life. Sometimes it looked like children born under a dynasty that had consumed their mother's own. And sometimes it looked like silence, the silence of women history did not ask enough questions about. Women who were remembered only as daughter of this king, wife of that ruler, mother of another claimant, as though their existence were merely connective tissue in the biographies of men. But they were not footnotes. They were where empire became personal. And that may be the most unsettling truth of all. Because what Roman generals did to the daughters of defeated kings was not always a single monstrous act, though sometimes it could be. More often, it was something colder, more systematic, and in some ways more terrifying. They took their futures. They repurposed their bloodlines. They turned them into symbols of submission. They used them to stabilize conquest. They made their bodies and names part of Rome's machinery, and then they called it order. That is how empires justify themselves, not by saying, "We are cruel," but by saying, "This is necessary, this is physiolized, this is politics, this is peace." But for the daughters standing in the shadow of triumphal Roman, peace often meant only this: the war was over, and their captivity had just begun. In the end, that is what these women reveal about Roman power. Not merely that Rome could defeat kings, but that it wanted more than victory. It wanted inheritance. It wanted continuity. It wanted the right to decide what would happen not only to a conquered kingdom's present, but to its future generations. That is why the daughters mattered, because if you control the daughters, you do not simply conquer the throne. You reach beyond it, into memory, into lineage, into history itself. And once an empire learns to do that, it is no longer just fighting wars. It is redesigning the human world. And for countless royal daughters dragged into that design, the most shocking truth was not that Rome defeated their fathers. It was that Rome intended to own what came after.